Napoleon's return to power was called the 100 Days. In this period of time fit and the triumphal entry into Paris and the disaster at Waterloo, could things have turned out differently? In the spring of 1814, after titanic efforts, the combined forces of almost all of Europe finally managed to crush Napoleon's empire. March 31, 1814 capitulated Paris, and on April 6, invincible Napoleon himself was forced to sign an abdication. And a few days later, on April 11, an additional treaty was concluded in Fontainebleau between the victors and the vanquished. Now we would call it a treaty of guarantees to the former emperor, who ceased to exercise his powers, and members of his family. But Bonaparte did not think of surrendering. According to the treaty, Napoleon and his wife, Marie-Louise, retained the titles of emperor and empress, but were stripped of their power over France. Their heirs were also forbidden to claim the French crown. In possession of Napoleon was transferred to the Island of Elba, the sovereignty of which was guaranteed by the Allied powers, with the right to maintain a personal guard of no more than 400 people. England, by the way, this treaty refused to sign. The British were embarrassed by the Island of Elba, chosen as a place of honorable exile of the Emperor of the French, too close to the coast of France. As it became clear later, the British fears were not in vain. For almost 10 months Napoleon was sovereign of this small Mediterranean island. His active nature could not stay in a long rest, so Napoleon immediately began to carry out in his new state a number of economic and social reforms. And he did it with the same thoroughness and seriousness with which he had previously settled multi-million France and the whole of the captured Europe. But, of course, all the emperor's thoughts were in France, in Paris, whence every day came more and more unhappy and more promising, for Napoleon, news. It was as if the Bourbons and the whole mass of noble émigrés pouring into France were on their own way to their doom. Embittered by years of wandering around Europe, who lost their castles and lands during the Revolution, these nobles finally returned to France, albeit at the bayonets of foreign invaders. The famous Talleyrand said in those days his famous phrase, "The Bourbons have forgotten nothing and learned nothing. They have not forgotten, so they will take revenge. And they have not learned, that is, they will seek to rule the country in the old way." The reign of Louis XVIII was rather cautious. The long years spent in exile had taken their toll. He preferred to keep quiet and not to anger the French with careless words and foolish decisions. Louis XVIII even outwardly looked the antipode of Napoleon. This excessively obese man with shortness of breath did not go in any comparison with the agile and energetic commander. The new king was not popular with his subjects. However, the proclamation of the brother of the executed Louis XVI as the new monarch in 1814 was symbolic, because exactly 1,000 years ago Louis I began to rule. But nothing else remarkable happened. Louis XVIII died in 1824, leaving no heir, and became the last king of France with that name. The king's younger brother, Charles Artois, seriously believed that it was possible to return France to the days of unlimited absolutism of the Sun King Louis XIV or to the gallant festivities of the amorous Louis XV, as if there had been no great revolution in 1789 and the subsequent Napoleonic epoch. Around the brother of the king clustered the most aggressive representatives of the nobility, and so, in general, far from liberal. Louis XVIII was forced to give the country a paltry constitution, the Charter of 1814. Only about 100,000 people out of almost 30 million of the French population received voting rights under it. But even this timid concession to society provoked the furious hatred of the ultra-royalists, who dreamed of a return to absolute, unrestricted power of the monarch. It is clear that such views were not sympathetic to the liberal French intelligentsia. Paradoxically, but even the surviving revolutionary Jacobins, who had previously been irreconcilable enemies of Napoleon, now began to dream of his return. He seemed to them a lesser evil compared to the Bourbons. But the most blatant madness of the new rulers of France was their behavior in the Peasant Question. The French Revolution had done away with noble estates. The lords, as well as the churches, lands had been nationalized by the revolutionary government, cut into equal pieces and sold to the peasants. And now the nobles who had returned to France began to talk about the need to revise the results of the revolution and return the confiscated lands to their former owners. The most intelligent among the nobles realized how impossible and dangerous such talk was. But their voices were drowned in the general chorus of the thirsty brethren. Of course, to really start taking away land plots, no one in the government dared to do such a thing. But this very talk about the need for land redistribution made the peasantry terribly nervous. All rural France began to perceive the Bourbons as their enemies. All that was needed was a man who could lead the fight against this apparent enemy. And all France knew the name of this man. Napoleon on Elba was well aware of what was going on in France. In February 1815, he came to the conclusion that the fruit was ripe. There was no point in waiting any longer. It is time to realize a daring plan to land in France and seize power again. At first glance, the idea seemed crazy. Yes, Napoleon had about 1,000 soldiers on the Elbe, more than was due to the treaty at Fontainebleau. But the unconcerned allies looked the other way. 400 men, 1,000, what difference does it make? It's still a drop in the ocean. This 1,000 soldiers were quite enough to ensure Napoleon's safety at the first moment of landing on the French coast. And beyond that? After all, the Bourbons have hundreds of thousands of soldiers at their command. They will sweep away Napoleon's 1,000. But these considerations did not frighten Napoleon at all. He knew that there were no Bourbon troops in France. They were all Napoleon's troops, his soldiers, with whom he had gone through his brilliant victorious campaigns and who adored their little corporal to the point of madness. Napoleon counted on his charisma, on the psychological influence on the soldiers, who at the first call will throw the hated white Bourbon banners and go to his side. And this calculation was fully justified. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon, having loaded 1,100 soldiers on several ships, set sail from Elba. The voyage went well, and on March 1st, Napoleon's soldiers were already landing at the Bay of Juan, on the Mediterranean coast of France. Without delay, Napoleon moved north. Any resistance to the usurper was out of the question. The inhabitants of small towns and villages met the emperor with sincere delight. Crowds of peasants accompanied Napoleon's army, singing songs and dancing with joy. As recalled an eyewitness to those events Fleury de Chaboulin, what was happening resembled some kind of mass insanity. People crowded onto the horses of Napoleon's entourage to see him, to hear him, to get a closer look, to touch his clothes. The purest madness reigned. But, sooner or later, the returning emperor had to face the government troops. This encounter took place near the village of Lamer, near Grenoble. Napoleon was blocked by 3 regiments of artillery. It was pointless to engage them. Napoleon did not have a single cannon, and the Bourbon regiments would simply scatter his detachment with artillery fire alone. But Napoleon did not want a battle. It was important to him to return to power without bloodshed. And it was here, near the village of Lamoureux, that the legendary scene took place. Eyewitnesses describe it as follows. Napoleon ordered his soldiers to lower their guns, and himself, unaccompanied, moved at a leisurely pace to the lined-up government troops. He came right up to the enemy line, and in fact to his own, still recently Napoleon's soldiers. Soldiers, do you recognize your emperor? Napoleon asked. If anyone wants to shoot at me, here I am. And Napoleon opened his surcoat across his chest. Thunderous shouts served as his answer. The entire Bourbon army threw down their guns and rushed towards Napoleon. The soldiers surrounded their idol, kneeling before him, kissing his hands and the edges of his clothes. A few royalist officers fled. Napoleon's triumph was complete. Cities and villages in the south of France, one after another without a single shot, passed into the hands of the Corsican ogre. It was enough for me to knock on the city gates with my snuff box, and they were opened, Napoleon later recalled. Napoleon. All military detachments sent by the authorities to stop the triumphal procession of the usurper, as soon as they saw a squat figure in a double corner, immediately went to the side of the true sovereign. It was then in Paris, in one of the squares, appeared in an ironic announcement, written by some joker on behalf of Napoleon. Dear Bourbons, please do not send me more soldiers. I have enough of them. Things were taking a very bad turn for the Bourbons. At first, when Paris first learned of Napoleon's landing in the Bay of Juan, the entire royal family and courtiers thought it was the work of a madman. 10 days later, Napoleon was already in Lyon, the second largest city in France, which he, like all other cities, took without a single shot. Shock, confusion, panic, such words can describe the state of the entire royal court in those March days. In a frantic attempt to save themselves, the Bourbons decided to oppose the invader, a man who was perhaps the most popular figure in the French army, after, of course, Napoleon himself, Marshal Ney. The hero of the Battle of Moscow, Borodino, Ney received for it from Napoleon the title of Prince of Moscow. Marshal did not shine with military and political talents, but was insanely brave and loved by the soldiers. For his desperate bravery and honesty, Ney received among contemporaries flattering nickname the Lion of the French Army. And now the Bourbons have entrusted this man to defeat Napoleon. Ney sincerely considered the return of Napoleon evil for France, for it inevitably meant a new war with all of Europe. And France, Ney thought, had already made a great many sacrifices on the altar of Napoleon's glory. The country needs peace and quiet. Departing to the troops, Ney hastily promised the king to bring Bonaparte in an iron cage. But the closer his regiments approached Lyons, the more gloomy became the mood of the soldiers. Officers avoided looking into the eyes of his commander, the soldiers sullenly silent, and those who were bolder directly declared to the marshal, "You'd better lead us to our emperor." Ney himself began to hesitate, seeing the mood of the soldiers and locals. Napoleon's note to Ney decided everything. "I will accept you as I accepted after the Battle of Moscow," wrote the emperor. Ney decided and joined Napoleon, for this later marshal will be shot by the Bourbons. In the morning of March 19th, the royal family fled Paris. And the very next day, March 20th, Napoleon's troops entered the French capital. So in just 3 weeks, without firing a single shot, this man regained power over a country of many millions. With what political program again ascended to the throne Napoleon Bonaparte? Genius military leader, and here he was able to surprise the whole world. This recent military dictator, unlimited ruler of France and almost all of Europe, who saw the only support for his power in the bayonets of soldiers, "The big battalions are always right," Napoleon liked to repeat, now spoke quite differently. From now on, Napoleon's motto was liberalization. Even on the way to Paris and already in Paris, the emperor repeatedly repeated that the former invasive policy will be over. France must concentrate on herself, and the emperor returned first to save the peasants from the Bourbons. Peasant lands are inviolable, Napoleon declared, thus ensuring the enthusiastic love of rural France. As for the internal organization of the state, Napoleon's ideal was now a constitutional monarchy. As soon as he entered Paris, the emperor immediately changed the Bourbon charter in the direction of even greater liberalization. The number of citizens who received the right to vote under these amendments increased many times, although, of course, there was no question of universal suffrage. Full freedom of the press and other constitutional freedoms were proclaimed. Although not so long ago, in 1813, Napoleon responded to a proposal to soften his authoritarian regime in the following way. "As long as it," here Napoleon put his hand on the hilt of his saber, "hangs at my side, you will not get any of the freedoms you are sighing for." How sincere was this Napoleonic liberality? Would all these good deeds have remained in force if Napoleon had managed to establish himself in power for any lengthy period of time? It is impossible to answer this question unequivocally. For as fate would have it, Napoleon did not succeed in gaining a foothold on the throne. It was not difficult for Napoleon to banish the Bourbons. It was much more difficult to get the anti-Napoleonic coalition allies, England, Austria, Prussia and Russia, to accept his reign. None of these allies, just then quarreled at the Congress of Vienna over the division of booty, did not want to return to power in France a man whose name alone inspired them with terror. A common enemy brings one closer together. And the Allies, forgetting previous offenses, began to prepare troops for the invasion of France. Napoleon also realized that his fate must be decided on the battlefield. June 12, 1815, he marched with the army in the direction of Belgium, where concentrated Anglo-Prussian troops Wellington and Blücher. On June 18, the fateful Battle of Waterloo took place. Napoleon suffered a total defeat. We tell you more about this historic battle in one of our issues. After Waterloo, Napoleon underwent a striking change. It seemed that something had broken in the soul of this man, destroyed some inner core that previously did not let him lose heart in the most difficult situations. Napoleon lost all interest in what was happening. June 21st, Napoleon returned to Paris. The next day he abdicated. His second reign of 100 days was over. But Napoleon could no longer count on a comfortable exile, like the Island of Elba. July 15, 1815, on board the British ship Bellerophon, Napoleon surrendered to his worst enemies, the British. The bloody 20-year epic of the Napoleonic Wars came to an end. So ended known throughout the world, the 100 Days of Napoleon Bonaparte. If you liked this video, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like and turn on notifications so that you do not miss the release of new videos. Share your impressions of the video in the comments.